This short video is for COMS1000 students to run through how we can start to deal with the data set that we collected related to handedness in week 5. The first thing you'll notice about this data set is that it looks a little bit different from the data sheet that you entered data into. That's because we've gone away and processed it a little bit to make it just a little bit easier to deal with. The main thing that we've done is that instead of having each observer recorded as a row and then 6 attempts across as different columns, we've now got each observation is a row. So the person who is in group 9 in Wednesday 10 AM has their 6 attempts, and those 6 attempts are recognised as unique rows. Unique observations are one of the things we'll usually use in any sort of scientific data collection. A unique identifier, followed by a little bit of information, followed by the results that we're interested in. The other thing to note is that we've effectively added in a column, and that column is called trial dominant. And that trial dominant column relates to whether or not the particular observation was made with a dominant hand or a non-dominant hand. So a right-hander throwing with a left hand is throwing with a non-dominant hand. A right-hander throwing with a right hand is throwing with a dominant hand. This is going to be a handy little column because it will start to summarise and start to take left or right out of it and just work with whether it's a dominant hand or a non-dominant hand. Right, so what are some of the little tricks we can use in Excel to make this just a little bit easier? So the first thing you'll notice is that this is a reasonably complex data set. We scroll right to the bottom, there's 1038 rows in there at the moment. So it's not a small data set that we've got floating around. So we need to find a way to summarise all of this data to make it workable. A couple of things that we need to do just to look through data sensibly. One of the easiest things we can do at a very starting point is just to freeze this top row so we can investigate the data a little bit better. To do that, we click somewhere in the front top row, go to the View tab in Excel, drop down the Freeze Panes button and hit Freeze Top Row. That now means that we can scroll through the rest of the document without having to guess or remember what that top row is. So it allows us to freeze those column names, which can be handy. The next little trick that is very useful is to apply filters. The easiest way to describe what that is just to show you. So to apply filters, we click on the Data tab and we click this Filter button. And you'll see that it introduces this little drop-down arrow next to each of the columns. That enables us to essentially hide some of the data. It also enables us to sort by some of the data. So let's say, for instance, that we were only interested in trials that were made with the left hand. We can exclude all the right hand data by clicking on that drop-down box next to the trial hand. And we can click off the right button and we're left with all the left hand throws and none of the right hand throws. And then let's say, for instance, that we're only interested in one of the workshops, the workshop that we were in, and in this case, let's say we're only interested in the Tuesday 8 AM. So now we've filtered for the trial hand, left hand, and the workshop 8 AM, and we've only got the left-handed throws from that workshop. The other nice thing that we can do with the filter function is to sort. And sorting helps us summarise the data sometimes. So let's look at the result column now, and let's sort that column A to Z, so alphabetical sorting of that column. And now we've got the make data at the top and the miss data down the bottom. And so that's taken all of these rows and sorted them by just this row. So now we can quite easily make a summary with a bit of pen and a piece of paper next to us And we can say that for left-handed throws at Tuesday 8 AM, there were that many successful throws. And in Excel, if we go down the bottom of the page, it tells us that there's 16 in this case. So 16 successful attempts with left-handed people at Tuesday at 8 AM. And we can highlight the misses as well. And down in the bottom column it says that there's 119 misses. So you could go through that and you could filter the data for what you wanted, and essentially make a summary with a piece of paper and a pen based on just those numbers, reasonably simply. Importantly, when you've finished collecting one bit of data, make sure that you click on the down button at that little drop down arrow again and just hit clear filter on all the ones that you've filtered so that you've got all the data there again. Right, so that's one way of looking at this data and trying to make sense of it and trying to summarise it a little bit. It's reasonably tedious though, it takes some time. So what I'm going to show you now is a nice little feature that Excel has that allows us to summarise complex data in a slightly quicker format. And it's called pivot tables. So what we want to do is highlight all of this data. Notice that by just clicking and dragging in the top column name, you highlight the whole column. Then go to Insert and hit Pivot Table. It'll come up with this dialog box, and really all you want to do with these is accept the defaults for the moment. It's saying that it's giving you the range that it's working with, which is the range that we highlighted, and telling you that we're going to put in a new worksheet. Hit OK, and you'll see that down the bottom it's created a new worksheet that doesn't have a name at the moment, and it's got this funny blank table here called a pivot table. It doesn't have anything in it at the moment, and on the right hand side it's got this pivot table fields sidebar that's appeared. So there's nothing in there at the moment, but what we can do is start to build a table that gives us information that we're interested in. So as a first pass, and something that might be interesting just to quickly eyeball some data, we might be interested to see how many throws were made and missed with dominant and non-dominant hands. So we can do that using the previous page. We can sort through it and we can go and look at just the dominant hands, and we can sort them A to Z, and we can highlight and count by doing those sorts of things as we did before. A pivot table will do that for us in a much quicker way. So down the bottom we have these 4 blank sheets, and we're going to drag and drop what we want into these to create a table. So in this case, I want to know whether we were using the dominant or non-dominant hand, and we've coded that into this column called trial dominant. So I can drag that down into the rows, and you'll see that up here it's started to create a table, so it's got those row names. And then we're interested in whether they were made or missed. And if we go back to this handedness table, we can see that that's in a column called result. So we can pull result down into columns. Now we're starting to get a little table there that starts to look like what we want. Now all we need is the values that sit in there. And the easiest way to do that is to pull the result column down into the values field, and it comes up with the numbers that we're looking for, and essentially goes through and counts all of the throws that were made with a dominant hand that were successful and unsuccessful, and puts it into this table for us, which is a really nice little feature. It stops us having to do all that individual counting. Immediately you'll see that there's some other drop down boxes here, and they look a lot like the drop down boxes in the filter that we had previously. One of the things we probably want to do is take the blanks off there because they're not particularly interesting. We can take off the row labels. and the column labels. And it gives us a table that actually has converted the data that we collected into some information that we can then use. You'll notice that one of the key things with this data is that there's not equal attempts in here. So one of the things we need to do is think about how we might represent that data, and the most logical way to do it is as a percentage rather than a raw count. And again, Excel will do that for us quite easily in a pivot table. If we go down to the bottom right of the screen and click the drop down box next to values, there's a little tab there that says value field setting. At the moment it's just showing counts, but we want to show it as a percentage, and the percentage we want to show is of the row title or the row total. So we want the percentage of shots that were success with the dominant hand or unsuccess with the dominant hand. So we need the percentage that were made against the total of that row. So we want a percentage of row total. Click on that and OK. And now we've got it as a percentage. And this is something that's much more comparable. And now you should be able to look at this table and very quickly make some conclusion about whether the dominant hand or the non-dominant hand was a better measure, or a more successful way of throwing. We can add to this again, and we can say, okay, we're also interested in whether the person was left-handed or right-handed to start with. So we can add another layer to this row labels. And in this case, we're going to use this, go back to our original data sheet, and whether the person was left-handed or right-handed sits in this column called dominant. So we're going to pull this dominant title, and we're going to put it down in the rows. And it will pull this in for us. In this case, it probably doesn't look fantastic. Really what we want, so at the moment it's in a hierarchy, so it's starting with dominant and then saying, okay, the throws with the left hand dominant, or left-handers with throwing with their dominant hand gives us this percentage, right-handers throwing with their dominant hand gives us this percentage, and we can work with that as well. Down in our pivot table fields, we can shift this around a bit. We can move that dominant to be higher in the hierarchy and get the same values, but just organised a little bit differently. So this data now is simply starting to give us a lot more information. We can start to drill down even more into what's going on with this data and how we might be able to express some of the trends in it. The last thing I'll show you with a pivot table is that you can also filter things here. So there are a couple of groups that were interested in what was happening as you increase the number of attempts. So we have a column called attempt, which is the number of the attempt. And let's put that into the filter. And we see a new row that appears at the top. And we can drop down there and say, okay, well, what happens at the first attempt that everybody made? And then we can say that at the first attempt, look at the success rate within each of these at attempt 1. And do people become more successful or less successful as we increase the number of attempts? So we can pull some of that data out that way. Right, so that's pivot tables. In a nutshell, they're a really good way of summarising data, and a really good way of taking complex data like this and turning it into information that you might be able to communicate. Like this. And there's one more thing that I'll show you as well, related to pivot tables, but it's slightly different. And it's called a pivot chart. So Excel is quite good at graphically presenting data. It's one of its key functions. But again, here we've got some reasonably complex data that we want to make some sense out of. And rather than going through and coding all of these things with numbers to make them manageable, we're going to create a pivot chart. So again, we're going to start off by highlighting all of our data. And in Insert, we're going to work across not from a pivot table, but across to a pivot chart. We get the same dialog box as we did before, and we're going to simply accept those defaults, and it's going to open up a separate sheet that looks a little bit like the other one we were doing, except all of a sudden we don't just have a table, we have a chart. So again, we might simply be interested in the effect of a dominant hand versus a non-dominant hand on the result. So we're going to create the same table that we did previously. We're going to have whether someone was working with their dominant hand, whether they had a successful result, did they make or miss the shot, and then we're going to ask Excel to count those. And what the pivot chart does is it automatically creates a chart for us, which is fantastic. It stops us having to go through and individually do these sorts of calculations for us. As before, we might be more interested in percentage, so we go through and hit the value field settings, show values as, percent of row total, and the graph stays exactly the same, it just scales it by percentage, and it enables us to look at percentage across here. Again, we'll take the blanks out because they start to distort things, and it actually Excel will try to graph the blanks, which is not particularly useful for what we want. Right, so that's a very basic chart of that data. Again, we could decide that we're also interested in whether the person is left-handed or right-handed. So we could pull the dominant hand down there, and it extends out the x-axis here, or the number of categories that it's using, and enables us to look at it in that way. In this case, it's grouped by dominant and non-dominant hand. If we go down to the bottom right-hand side and we shift the dominant up, it changes it, and that enables us to look at left-hand versus right-handed people. So it really depends, the information that we're trying to project depends on the questions that we're asking. In this case, we do have a couple of ambidextrous people. We can choose to include those or exclude them. One of the key things here, of course, is that ambidextrous people are always shooting with a dominant hand. So it's probably not adding a great deal to what we're doing. So let's go across, remove ambidextrous and blanks from what we're talking about, and clean up the figure a little bit more. You should notice that there's a couple of things that are different about this figure to the sort of things you would see in a piece of published literature. One of the things that's missing, of course, is a label on this axis. And we've also got these funny little symbols along here. And they're just remnants of having a pivot chart. So let's just go through and see how we might be able to tidy this chart up to make it look more presentable for a report. So the first thing we want to do is add a title to the y-axis. We do that by clicking somewhere in the plot, going up to the top and hitting Design. We're going to add a chart element, add an axis title, a vertical title, and we're going to call this percentage of shots. And that's going to be a little bit hard to read when we go and copy this into a Word document. So we click on that, go to Home, and these buttons will increase the size and decrease the size until they look something like there's something that we would want to see. One of the other things that this new version of Excel does that I don't particularly like is that it doesn't include a line down the y-axis here. It also includes grid lines, which you don't usually see in a published work. So if we click somewhere in that axis and go to Format, we can go to Shape Outline and say we want a black outline, please. We can do the same on the x-axis and do the same thing. You also notice that by default, Excel is putting this in a bit of a grey colour. Again, not something that I particularly like, so I'll always go through and go back to the Home tab and make these black. Just to make them pop out a little bit more. Now, as I said, in most literature you won't see grid lines, so you can highlight those and just press the backspace key, and that'll get rid of all the grid lines. Now, the other thing we don't want these buttons floating around, and that's reasonably easy to fix. Up in the pivot chart tools, we go to Analyze, across to Field Buttons, Hide All, and they helpfully disappear for us. The last thing that you would probably do is click somewhere in here, go to Format, and the shape outline of the whole plot, you just remove it to no outline. So when that gets copied across into a Word document, you can do that just by coming across to either Control-C, Control-V, or right-click, copy, and paste into a Word document. You can very quickly see that it's going to be a nice format. The other thing to note is that in most scientific literature, you need to work in grayscale, which means you're using black, whites, greys. Colour is much more expensive to publish. In technical reports, you would usually tend to use some colour. But these things are quite easy to change. If you click on the bar that you're interested in, right click, go to Format Data Series, you'll get this side tab. This little button is about fill and line. We can put a solid fill, and then we can choose the colour that we're going to make it. And we'll do the same thing for the other one, but we'll make it white. Oops. Unfortunately for that one, we don't have any border. We need to add a solid line border so that we can actually see it. There we are. Right, so that's starting to look more like what we would expect for a scientific journal. The only other thing to note with a pivot chart is that although this is interesting, we might again be more interested in percentages. And if we right click within this chart, we can go to this button down here that says Change Chart Type. And it gives us a couple of options. And one of the interesting ones for our purposes is likely to be a stacked column. That stacked column gives us a bit of an idea of the relative percentages of making and missing shots for left-handers and right-handers working with dominant and non-dominant hands. So this gives us a little bit more information again, and we can then copy and paste that across. Right, so that's a very quick summary of a way that we can go from a reasonably complex data set to create a table that gives us a little bit more information that we can start to work with and start pulling a little bit of information into and out of, converting the data into information that we can communicate, and how we might be able to create a basic plot out of that data again. There are lots of other ways that you can create plots in Excel, but the pivot chart is a way of just easily summarising that sort of data into that sort of figure.